Our gospel reading for this morning comes from very close to the close of John's gospel, a last resurrection appearance following Easter Sunday. Listen for what the Spirit might speak to us through these words. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Canaan in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just about daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it. And now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring me some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hand, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Do you love me? Does anyone ever ask you that question? They don't come much more freighted than that. If you hear this question from a spouse, a partner, a lover, a child, a parent, what runs through your mind as you think how to respond? Do you love me is rarely an innocent question. It is rarely a query for simple information. The question could be manipulative. It could come from a place of hurt and doubt. It could arise from a hope that another would respond yes. But whatever its origins, almost all such questions share an assumption that love gets enacted, that it gets lived out in certain ways. Sometimes this subtext even gets spoken. If you loved me, you would. If you loved me, you would not. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Simon Peter had earlier spoken of his great love, presumably greater than the other disciples, when he professed that he was willing to die for Jesus. But when danger had come, he had folded, had even denied knowing Jesus. Surely, do you love me was a terrible question for Peter. But this passage is about more than Peter's restoration. The threefold questioning of Jesus does certainly seem to undo the threefold denial by Peter. But on a larger scale, this passage is about the church and about its ministry in the world after Jesus has died and has been raised. And in that sense, this question to Peter is a question to any who would follow Jesus. James, Diane, Sam, Mary, Bill, Dawn, do you love me? There's a problem here, though. I'm afraid that we hear this question quite differently than Peter did. For Simon Peter, there's really no question that he loves Jesus deeply. Just look at his buffoonish behavior when he realizes who that man on the beach is. Faith is such a somber, serious business. We sometimes miss the humor in the Bible, and we miss it here. Peter, unable to wait, diving headlong into the water. But before he jumps in, making himself presentable by putting some clothes on. I'm sure he looked very presentable, dragging himself out of the water, clothes dripping wet, not saying a word. We never act nearly so foolishly as Peter. We rarely jump headlong into the water. We form committees. We examine every option, every possibility. Not that Peter's impulsiveness is always a good thing, but it does arise from a very different place than much of our religious behavior does. Simon is so enamored, so in love with Jesus, that it leads him to all sorts of foolish and ridiculous behaviors, so that Jesus' questions to him are not really so much about whether he loves, but about giving that love the shape it needs to take. But Jesus isn't nearly so viscerally real and present to me. Jesus very often is a collection of teachings, a way of living, a call to action, not someone that I can fall in love with, not someone that leads me to make a fool of myself for. And so that question, do you love me, doesn't strike me the same way it must have struck Peter. Do I love you? Well, I love your ideas. You got some real good points. But do I love you? I don't know. Perhaps this is why John's gospel goes to such lengths to set up the conversation that Jesus has with Peter. It insists in the preamble that Jesus is still there and present to the church. still directing them, still providing abundantly, even miraculously for them. For Peter and the other disciples, Jesus is present in such a way that they respond with passion and devotion that is of the same sort that they felt when they were with Jesus prior to the cross. For Peter, that passion sometimes leads to foolishness. And so Jesus has to redirect, has to channel that passion. Feed my lambs. Tend my sheep. But if I have not experienced the presence of Jesus, not felt a sense of devotion and passion that leads me into occasional fits of foolishness, then channeling passion is not really the issue. Now, on this point, I have to confess to a rather typical liberal problem of being just a tiny bit embarrassed by the Bible. Resurrections, miraculous feedings and catches of fish, stilling a storm, walking on the water, changing water into wine. Did any of this really happen? Surely it's metaphor. Metaphor about God's presence or Jesus' connection to God, right? I mean, after all, I'm an educated, even intellectual Christian. I know better than to take the Bible literally. When I do counseling with couples that I'm going to marry, I have them chart their families back for a few generations. And we use these charts to look for family patterns that repeat from generation to the next generation. This charting employs a variety of symbols and different types of lines to do it. And one of these lines is labeled cut off, estrangement. And the label then adds in parentheses, but still a strong tie to this person. Cut off, estranged, but still a strong tie. Most of us have seen this sort of thing. There are former spouses who cannot attend their child's wedding if their ex is there too. There are siblings, estranged siblings, who cannot live in the same town. If one were to move to town, the other would have to find a new place to live. They are estranged, cut off from one another, and yet they still exert tremendous control over one another's behavior. Now we Presbyterians, especially we liberal-leaning Presbyterians, fancy ourselves the smart, sophisticated siblings of the Christian family. And at times we're more than a little embarrassed by some of our simpler, less educated brothers and sisters. And yet they still exhibit a tremendous amount of influence over us. Very often we define ourselves in response to them. Some of our ways of being Christian are knee-jerk reactions out of a fear that we might be mistaken for our less sophisticated brothers and sisters. Did the risen Jesus walk on the beach that morning and direct the disciples to a miraculous catch of fish and have bread and fish ready when Simon came ashore? Did he still storms and change water into wine? And what leads us to answer yes or no? I'm struck by the fact that very often I find it easier to believe in the Big Bang that gave rise to our universe than to believe in some of Jesus' miracles. I'm not the least bit embarrassed or defensive about accepting at face value the idea that the universe at one time existed as a singularity of infinite density and infinite temperature, even though the mechanics of such an event are every bit as inconceivable to me as they would be for the events of resurrection or walking on water or turning water into wine. Simon, son of John, do you love me? James, son of Ken, do you love me? In John's Gospel, Simon hears that question and is deeply wounded. But am I? Can I be? If I cannot, then Jesus' command to care for his flock is not about divine love that I have encountered and experienced that has filled me with a passion that Jesus calls me to share. It is just another metaphor for morality and goodness and kindness. All fine and admirable things, as the vast majority of atheists and agnostics and spiritual but not religious and faiths of every stripe and creed would agree, but nothing requiring the presence of churches and worship services where we offer up our prayers and our adoration and our praise. But if Jesus is really risen, if the Spirit indeed allows me to encounter the risen Christ, to know him and to be joined to him, if Jesus really does direct and care for and provide, if I really can love him, all praise and glory to the risen one